My parents bought my sister an estate, then handed me the deed to pay. You're rich. It's time you help family. I refused. They sued for $600,000, so the judge asked one question. My name is Vanessa. I am 32 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I was the daughter who was just fine. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one my parents never had to lose a single minute of sleep over. Growing up, I used to think my family was living in two completely different movies playing on the exact same screen. My older sister, Chelsea, was the star of a vibrant, loud, coming-of-age blockbuster. Chelsea is 2 years older than me, and she was born for the applause. She was the varsity cheerleader, the girl with the perfect smile, the one who walked into a room and naturally expected everyone to stop and look. And they did. My parents treated her life like a spectator sport. When she brought home AC on her report card, my mom would wrap her in a hug and tell her how proud she was that Chelsea tried her absolute best and that grades did not define her beautiful spirit. My movie, on the other hand, was a very quiet, low-budget indie drama. I was in the math league. I got straight A's. I never missed a curfew because I rarely went out. When I brought home a perfect report card, my dad, Harrison, would barely glance up from his newspaper, give a curt nod, and say, "Good, keep it up." There was no party. There was no praise. It was just the baseline expectation. I was Vanessa. I was the smart one. I didn't need cheering on. The defining moment of our two movies happened when we turned 16. When Chelsea turned 16, my parents threw a massive backyard barbecue. But the real show was in the driveway. They bought her a brand new red convertible. She did not even have her full driver's license yet, just a learner's permit, but my mom, Brenda, insisted it would motivate her to pass the test. I can still picture the ridiculous oversized white bow on the hood. Chelsea screamed, cried, and jumped into my parents' arms. It was a picture-perfect family moment. 2 years later, I turned 16. There was no barbecue. After dinner, my dad handed me a plain white envelope. Inside was a savings bond for $100. He gave me a firm pat on the shoulder and delivered a 5-minute lecture on the importance of compound interest and building good credit early. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding that piece of paper, feeling a tight, hot knot in my throat. But I swallowed it down. I told myself it was fine. I convinced myself that being the responsible, low-maintenance daughter was a badge of honor. I rationalized it by thinking that one day, when we were adults, they would look at the stable, successful life I built and finally see my true value. I thought they would respect me. I had absolutely no idea that I was just being programmed for a lifetime of servitude. By the time we reached adulthood, the roles were permanently cemented. Chelsea went to a big state school, majored in communications, and joined a top-tier sorority. My parents paid for absolutely everything. The out-of-state tuition, the sorority dues, the wild spring break trips to Cabo. She met a guy named Spencer, and they got married right after graduation. The wedding was a spectacle. My parents must have dropped easily $50,000 on it. There were ice sculptures, a live 10-piece band, and a custom designer dress. I was the maid of honor, which really just meant I was the unpaid event coordinator. I spent the entire day running around with a clipboard, making sure the caterers were paid, pinning up Chelsea's hem, and keeping my parents' wine glasses full. During the reception, my dad gave a tearful speech about how Chelsea was the light of his life. I stood in the background, holding her bouquet, completely invisible. I went to college too, but I chose a school in Seattle, 2 hours away from them. I wanted to be on my own. I got a partial scholarship, worked 2 jobs waiting tables, and majored in finance. I paid my own way. When I graduated with honors, my parents did show up. But they sat way in the back, and they left before the ceremony even finished because Chelsea had called to say she had a minor sinus infection and they were worried about her. I drove myself back to my tiny apartment that day, alone. The dynamic was maddening. Every Thanksgiving dinner followed the exact same script. Chelsea, now a mother of 2 little boys, would look exhausted. My mother would stare at her with pure, unadulterated adoration, praising her for just existing. Then, the crosshairs would shift to me. My mom would put on this sweet, pitying voice and ask if my apartment wasn't terribly lonely. My dad would chime in, treating my single status like a broken engine, asking when I was going to settle down because time was ticking. They made it clear that my career as a financial analyst meant nothing. My independence was a flaw. Yet, the hypocrisy was staggering. The second they needed something real, something practical, they did not call the light of their life. When my dad's truck blew a transmission and he needed a quick $2,000 to fix it, he called me. When my mom's tax returns got overly complicated, she mailed a box of receipts to my apartment and expected it done by the weekend. I wasn't treated like a daughter. I was an unpaid contractor. I was the family mechanic, the accountant, the emergency fund. And like an idiot, I kept doing it, hoping that being useful would eventually translate into being loved. The financial drain started slowly, like a leaky faucet you learn to ignore. It was never framed as me supporting them. It was always framed as me chipping in or helping out because I was the one with the good job. I lived a very frugal life in Seattle. My apartment was painfully gray and utilitarian. My sofa was a secondhand Craigslist find. I meal prepped rice and beans not because I was broke, but because I had an intense, almost paranoid obsession with saving money. I equated a heavy savings account with safety, because I knew deep down that if I ever fell, no one in my family would be there to catch me. I had to be my own safety net. But my savings constantly took hits from them. One summer, Chelsea tearfully called to say she could not afford to send her 2 boys to the summer camp all their friends were going to. She said it would break their hearts. I felt terrible for my nephews. I wired her $2,000 to cover the tuition. 2 weeks later, I was scrolling through social media and saw Chelsea posting dozens of photos from a luxury couple's spa weekend in Napa Valley. She was holding a glass of champagne, wearing a plush robe, with the caption about taking time for self-care. When I gently confronted my mom about it, asking why I paid for the camp if Chelsea had money for a luxury vacation, my mom immediately flipped the script. She told me I was being petty and keeping score. She said Chelsea works so hard as a mother and deserves a break, and since I don't have the burden of children, I should be happy to bless my family with my extra income. That was the word she used. Burden. As if my nephews were a tax I was obligated to help pay. Every time I tried to set a boundary, I was hit with a tidal wave of guilt. They weaponized my success against me. They made me feel like my money was not actually mine, it was just family resources that happened to be resting in my bank account. And, because I was so desperate to maintain some illusion of a family connection, I kept transferring the funds. I kept playing the role. I kept telling myself that this is just what families do, even as the resentment built up in my chest like a heavy, cold stone. But the leaky faucet was about to become a flood. The fragile house of cards Chelsea had built was about to collapse, and I was the one they expected to stand under it. The real nightmare started on a completely average Tuesday morning. It was 10 o'clock. I was sitting in the glass-walled conference room at my firm, right in the middle of presenting a crucial quarterly financial review to my department heads. My phone, sitting face down on the table, started buzzing. I ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. It was Chelsea. She never called me during work hours unless she needed money, and even then, she usually just texted. I excused myself, stepped out into the quiet hallway, and answered. I expected her to ask for a few $100 for a car repair. Instead, I was hit with a sound I had never heard from my sister before. It was a raw, ugly, hyperventilating wail. It took me a solid minute to get her to form a coherent sentence. Spencer was gone. Not just gone for the day. Gone. He had packed his clothes while she was dropping the kids at school. He cleared out their joint checking and savings accounts. Every single penny. He left a note saying he had been unhappy for years and was moving out of state. I didn't feel sadness for her in that moment. My brain instantly snapped into crisis management mode. I asked her where she was. She was at her house. She told me the power was off. The electric company had cut it that morning because Spencer had not paid the bill in 3 months, and she had no idea. She said the kids were hungry, and she literally did not have $1 to her name to buy milk. I walked back into the conference room, told my boss I had a severe family emergency, grabbed my coat, and left. I drove 2 hours straight from Seattle to the suburbs. The entire drive, I didn't listen to music. I just made mental lists. Food, utilities, legal counsel, bank freezes. I was Vanessa the fixer. This was a massive problem, and I was the designated mechanic. When I finally pulled into her driveway, the reality of the situation hit me. The house was dead silent and completely dark inside. I walked through the front door into a mess. There were dishes piled high in the sink, smelling faintly of sour milk. My 2 young nephews were sitting on the living room rug, staring blankly at a dead television, looking genuinely scared. I found Chelsea curled up on the sofa, wrapped in a heavy winter blanket despite it being a warm day. Her eyes were red and swollen. But the thing that stood out to me, the detail that made a tiny, cold spark of anger ignite in my chest, was her hands. As she wiped her tears, I saw that her fingernails were freshly manicured. A perfect, expensive-looking French tip. She had gotten her nails done while her electric bill was 90 days past due. I went straight to the kitchen and opened the fridge. A blast of warm, stale air hit my face. It was completely empty, save for a crusty bottle of ketchup and a shriveled half-lemon. I didn't hug her. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I put my purse on the counter, pulled out my laptop, and went to work. I tethered my laptop to my phone's hotspot. First priority, the power. I navigated to the utility company's website, bypassed the automated warnings, and paid the overdue balance, plus the reconnection fee, straight from my own credit card. It was nearly $500. Within 20 minutes, the lights flickered back on, and the refrigerator hummed to life. The kids cheered for a brief second, but Chelsea didn't even move from the couch. Next was food. I told Chelsea to take a shower and watch the boys. I drove to the nearest mega grocery store. I didn't just buy a few pizzas to tide them over. I walked the aisles like a logistics manager stocking a bunker. I bought gallons of milk, boxes of cereal, bread, cheese, chicken breasts, pasta, fresh fruit, and vegetables. I went down the baby aisle and loaded up on diapers and wipes for the younger nephew. I bought toilet paper, laundry detergent, and dish soap. I was swiping items into the cart so fast my arms ached. When the cashier gave me the total, it was over $450. I swiped my card without blinking. I got back to the house, hauled all the heavy bags inside by myself, and started putting everything away. Chelsea was still on the couch, in the exact same position. I made the boys peanut butter sandwiches and poured them large glasses of milk. They ate like they hadn't seen food in days. I asked Chelsea where our parents were. She mumbled that she had called them right after she called me, and they were on their way. They lived 45 minutes away. It took them 7 hours to arrive. When Harrison and Brenda finally burst through the front door, it was a theatrical performance. They didn't even look in my direction. They rushed straight to the living room, falling onto the sofa on either side of Chelsea. My mom gathered her golden child into her arms and wailed. My dad paced the floor, his face red, shouting about how Spencer was a monster, a coward, and how he was going to hunt him down and kill him. They held her hands, they stroked her hair, they promised her that the family would protect her. I stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, holding a damp sponge. I had just finished washing the mountain of dirty dishes Spencer had left behind. The fridge was full because of me. The lights were on because of me. The kids had clean diapers because of me. But in that living room, I was completely invisible. They never asked how the situation was stabilized. They never turned around and said, "Thank you, Vanessa, for stepping in." I was just the hired help fading into the wallpaper while the real family grieved together. That Tuesday was just the beginning. The next 6 months became an absolute blur of bleeding cash. Spencer's exit was incredibly messy. He had hidden debts, maxed out credit cards in Chelsea's name, and completely abandoned the mortgage. The bank foreclosed on their house rapidly. Chelsea and the boys were getting evicted, and they had nowhere to go. My parents claimed their house was too small to take in 2 wild toddlers. So, The burden fell right where it always did. On me. I found Chelsea a decent, clean 2-bedroom apartment in a safe school district. Because her credit was destroyed by Spencer, the landlord wouldn't even look at her application. I had to co-sign the lease. I paid the first month, the last month, and the security deposit out of my own pocket. I told myself it was just a temporary bridge until she got a job. It was not temporary. For the next 6 months, I was paying her entire rent. $2,000 a month, automatically zelled from my account to hers, just so my nephews wouldn't be homeless. And then there were the legal fees. Chelsea needed a divorce lawyer, a ruthless one, to track down the money Spencer hid. I did the research and found a high-powered attorney in Seattle named Naomi. Naomi was a shark. I drove Chelsea to the consultation, and when Naomi demanded a $5,000 retainer fee to take the case, Chelsea just sat there and cried. I pulled out my credit card and paid it. My parents? They provided emotional support. They took Chelsea out for lunches to cheer her up. They watched the boys occasionally, but only on weekends when the weather was nice and they felt like playing grandparents. The breaking point for my patience came during a phone call with my mom. I was sitting at my desk, looking at my shrinking savings account, feeling a genuine panic attack coming on. I called her, my voice shaking. I told her that Naomi's legal bill for the month was another $2,000 and the rent was due next week. I told her I was drowning and needed them to chip in. There was a long, terrible pause on the line. And then, my mother used a voice so sweet and dripping with condescension it made my skin crawl. Well, what do you want us to do, Vanessa, she said. Your father and I are on a fixed income. You are the one with the big corporate career. You are the one without a husband or a family to support. This is just a season of giving for you. I felt the air leave my lungs. I am supporting a family, Mom. Hers. I've spent thousands. A thank you would be nice. A little help from you would be nice. Oh, honey, don't be so dramatic, she laughed lightly. We are also incredibly grateful for you. You are holding this family together. But you have to understand, it's your duty. It's just what families do. We take care of each other. It's what families do. That phrase echoed in my head long after I hung up. I realized something profound in that moment. I was not helping my sister get back on her feet. I was enabling my parents' favoritism. They got to play the loving, supportive heroes without spending a dime, while I was being taxed for simply existing as a single, responsible adult. I wasn't an aunt. I was a blood bank, and they were bleeding me dry while calling me selfish for flinching. I decided, right then and there, that the bank was closing. Hey guys, quick pause here. If you are enjoying this story and want to hear how I finally turned the tables on my toxic family, please hit that like button on the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me the name of the city you are watching from. Every single comment helps push this video to more people who might be going through the exact same thing. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to the drama. The phone call came on a lazy Sunday afternoon. I was sitting in my living room, drinking a cup of cheap instant coffee, trying to figure out how to balance my budget for the upcoming month. My phone rang, and when I saw it was my mother, I braced myself for another crisis. But when I answered, her voice was light. It was bright. It was a sound I had not heard from her since the day of Chelsea's wedding. She told me that they had wonderful news. She said they had finally solved everything regarding Chelsea's living situation, and she wanted me to come over to the house for a celebration dinner. She insisted I be there by 6 o'clock, and she hung up before I could ask a single follow-up question. I am embarrassed to admit this now, but as I drove the 2 hours to their house, I actually felt a tiny, stupid spark of hope. I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, they had figured out a way to pay me back. Maybe Spencer had been forced by a judge to hand over a lump sum of alimony. Maybe they had taken out a small loan to reimburse me for the rent and the lawyer fees I had been covering for half a year. I had put thousands of dollars on my credit cards, and my own safety net was dangerously thin. I wanted to believe that the celebration was for our whole family finally finding stable ground. When I pulled into their driveway, the familiar knot in my stomach returned. I walked through the front door, and the atmosphere in the living room felt less like a celebration and more like a staged intervention. Harrison was pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace, practically beaming with pride. Brenda was coming out of the kitchen holding a bottle of expensive red wine and 3 glasses. Notably, there was no glass for me. Chelsea was sitting on the edge of the sofa, looking down at her hands, completely avoiding my eye contact. My mother announced my arrival as if I were a guest of honor. She told me to sit down in the big armchair. I sat. The room felt incredibly tense. I tried to force a smile and asked what the big news was. My father stopped pacing. He stood tall, looking like a CEO about to announce a corporate merger. He told me that he and my mother had found the absolute perfect solution for Chelsea and the boys. He walked over to the coffee table and picked up a thick, glossy folder. He slid it across the glass surface until it stopped right in front of me. My hands felt instantly cold. I opened the folder. It was not a lease agreement for a nice townhouse. It was a real estate brochure and a stack of mortgage approval documents. The pictures in the brochure showed a massive, sprawling luxury estate. It was located in a highly exclusive, gated community. It had a 3-car garage, pristine landscaping, and a huge backyard with a custom swimming pool. I looked at the paperwork. The purchase price listed was $600,000. My parents' names were on the deed. I looked up, completely disoriented. I asked them how this was even possible. I reminded them that they were retired, living on fixed incomes, and Chelsea had 0 credit and no job. My mother sat down next to Chelsea, her eyes shining with tears of joy. She explained that it was incredibly important for the boys to have a real yard and a safe neighborhood after all the trauma they had been through. She proudly announced that she and my dad had cashed out a massive portion of their retirement funds to put down a $120,000 down payment to secure the property. I was stunned. I felt the air get sucked out of the room. I stared at the numbers on the paper. I did the math in my head. I looked at my father and pointed out that even with that down payment, the monthly mortgage, taxes, and insurance on a luxury estate like that would be at least $4,000 a month. I asked how Chelsea was supposed to pay that. My father's smile vanished instantly. His face went deadly serious. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Chelsea is not going to pay it, Vanessa. You are." I literally could not breathe. I just sat there, staring at him, waiting for the punchline of a very sick, very cruel joke. But nobody was laughing. My father continued speaking in a flat, factual tone, as if he were simply assigning me a chore like taking out the trash. He told me that they had looked up the average salary for a senior financial analyst in Seattle online. He stated that I made more than enough money to cover the $4,000 monthly payment. He reasoned that since I did not have a husband, did not have children, and lived in a cheap apartment, I had no real expenses. He said it was a simple, logical family decision. I looked from my father's hard, entitled face to my mother's pleading expression to my sister, who was still staring holes into the living room carpet. They had discussed this. They had planned this behind my back. They had literally purchased a luxury mansion with the explicit assumption that they could just hand me the bill. The good news was not for me. I was just the funding source. When I finally found my voice, it did not sound like my own. It was thin, cold, and shaking with an absolute primal rage. I asked them to clarify. I asked if they were seriously telling me that they bought their favorite daughter a mansion, and they were ordering me to pay for it for the next 30 years. My mother flinched. She reached out and tried to touch my knee, telling me not to say it like that. She started rambling about how it was an investment for the whole family, and how I had all this extra income just sitting around doing nothing. She asked me, in all seriousness, what else I was possibly going to spend my money on. My future. My own home. My own life. I stood up. My legs felt weak, but the anger kept me upright. I looked down at the 3 of them, the unholy trinity of my childhood. I told them absolutely not. My father's face darkened instantly. The vein in his neck bulged. He stepped toward me and demanded to know what I just said. I raised my voice. I told him no. I told him he bought the house so he could figure out how to pay for it. My mother gasped, standing up and clutching her chest. She asked how I could be so incredibly selfish. She screamed that they were my family. I let out a loud, bitter laugh. I asked her where this precious family was when I was paying Chelsea's rent for the last 6 months. I asked where this family was when I put $5,000 on my credit card for a divorce lawyer. I asked where they were when I was buying groceries so my nephews wouldn't starve in the dark. I told my mother she didn't want a daughter, she wanted an ATM machine, and I was officially out of order. Chelsea finally looked up, her eyes full of tears, and begged me to think of her boys. I snapped at her to get a job and start thinking of her own boys instead of letting our parents pimp out my bank account to fund her lifestyle. My father lost his mind. He shouted that they had raised me. They had given me life. He pointed a shaking finger at the front door and told me that if I walked out that door, I was no longer his daughter. He told me I would be dead to them. I looked into my father's eyes, searching for even a tiny fraction of parental love. I found absolutely nothing. Just a bully who was angry he couldn't control his wallet anymore. I told him that was the best deal he had offered me all night. I turned around, walked out the front door, and I did not slam it. I closed it quietly, definitively. I got into my car, gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and drove back to Seattle. I didn't cry a single tear. I just felt clean. For exactly 3 days, my world was completely silent. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner. I checked my phone and there was nothing. A tiny, foolish part of me wondered if they were feeling ashamed. I wondered if they were trying to figure out a way to apologize for crossing such an insane line. I was so incredibly wrong. They weren't feeling remorse. They were mobilizing their troops. The first attack came on Thursday afternoon. It was a phone call from my Aunt Gloria, my mother's older sister. I always liked Aunt Gloria. She was the one who remembered my birthday and sent me $20 gift cards. When I answered, her voice was raspy and dripping with disappointment. She told me she had just spoken to my mother, and her heart was completely broken. I let out a sigh of relief, thinking my mother had confessed what they tried to do. I told Aunt Gloria it was an awful situation, and I couldn't believe they tried to force me to pay a mortgage. Aunt Gloria went dead silent. Then she snapped at me. She asked what on earth I was talking about. She said my mother was destroyed because I had cruelly refused to help my sister in her darkest hour. My blood ran cold. I asked her what exactly my mother had told her. Aunt Gloria laid out the narrative they had constructed. My parents had told the entire extended family that they found a modest, highly affordable little house for Chelsea. They claimed they gently asked me for a tiny, temporary financial contribution just to help with the closing costs. According to their story, I had laughed in their faces, called Chelsea a pathetic failure, and bragged that I would rather buy myself a new luxury sports car than help my own flesh and blood. I was paralyzed. I literally could not make a sound. Aunt Gloria kept talking, telling me that I would never understand true sacrifice until I became a mother, and that hoarding my wealth while my nephews suffered made me a monster. She told me to call my mother and beg for forgiveness, and then she hung up on me. My phone started buzzing constantly. It was a coordinated strike. My cousin Peyton texted me to say I was a sociopath. My Uncle Russell left a voicemail saying I was a disgrace to the family name. They had twisted the story so masterfully. They erased the $600,000 price tag. They erased the $4,000 a month demand. Most importantly, they erased the thousands of dollars I had already spent keeping Chelsea afloat for the last 6 months. In their story, they were the noble, sacrificing martyrs, Chelsea was the helpless victim, and I was the greedy, corporate villain hoarding my gold. They were doing this to isolate me. They believed that if they applied enough social pressure, if they made me the pariah of the family, I would eventually crack. They thought the shame would break me, and I would come crawling back with my checkbook open, just to be allowed back into the fold. I sat on my cheap Craigslist sofa and watched the hateful messages roll in. And then I made a choice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't send out mass texts trying to explain the truth. I just opened my contacts. I blocked Aunt Gloria. I blocked Cousin Peyton. I blocked Uncle Russell. I blocked Chelsea. I blocked my mother. And finally, I blocked my father. I put my phone face down on the table. The apartment was profoundly silent. It was the loneliest I had ever felt in my entire life, but it was also the first time I had ever felt truly free. 2 months passed. 2 quiet, peaceful, boring months. I adjusted to my new reality as an orphan by choice. I started sleeping through the night. I stopped having panic attacks when my phone vibrated. I thought the worst was over. I thought they had realized they couldn't break me and had moved on to whatever backup plan they had for their massive mortgage. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening, I checked my mail in the lobby of my building. Mixed in with the grocery store flyers and a gas bill was a thick, heavy, cream-colored envelope. The return address was a prestigious law firm located downtown. My heart didn't race. It just started to beat with a slow, heavy thud. I took the elevator up to my apartment, walked into my kitchen, and opened the envelope with a butter knife. I pulled out a stack of dense legal documents. The first page read, Official Summons and Complaint. Plaintiff, Harrison and Brenda Mitchell. Defendant, Vanessa Mitchell. I leaned against the kitchen counter, my legs suddenly feeling like water. They had actually done it. They were suing me. I scanned down to the demand amount. They were suing me for exactly $600,000. My first thought was that they were literally trying to sue me for the exact purchase price of Chelsea's luxury estate. I thought it was a scare tactic, a fake document designed to terrify me into compliance. But as I flipped to the second page, I saw Exhibit A. It was an itemized list of expenses. I knew instantly that my mother had typed it. It was impeccably organized. It was a bill for my entire childhood. Line item 1, food and sustenance for 18 years, $20,000. Line item 2, clothing and apparel for 18 years, $40,000. Line item 3, housing and utility share, $90,000. They were charging me retroactive rent for my childhood bedroom. Line item 4, non-collegiate educational expenses and recreation, $25,000. But the line that actually made me let out a short, hysterical bark of a laugh was line item 5. Emotional guidance and support, $60,000. I stared at that line. Emotional guidance. They were billing me for the privilege of being ignored. They were putting a price tag on the years of making me stand in the background while they worshipped my sister. I flipped to the final page. The grand total of my childhood expenses came to $324,000. The final line item, placed right at the bottom, read, Financial assistance required for completion of Mitchell family property, $276,000. It all made a sick, twisted kind of sense. They knew they couldn't legally sue me just to pay for a house I didn't live in. So they constructed this absurd, offensive argument that I owed them a massive debt for keeping me alive as a child, and they were using that fictional debt to legally force me to fund Chelsea's mansion. They were attempting to weaponize the legal system to accomplish what their emotional manipulation had failed to do. This was not family drama anymore. This was not anger. This was cold, calculated, financial warfare. They were trying to destroy my life so my sister could have a swimming pool. I set the papers down on the counter. The numbness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard, crystalline focus. I picked up my phone, opened my web browser, and searched for the contact information of the most aggressive family law attorney I knew. I searched for Naomi, the shark I had hired for Chelsea's divorce. I sent her an email with the summons attached, asking for a meeting the very next morning. If my parents wanted to talk about receipts, we were going to talk about receipts. Naomi's office was on the 34th floor of a high-rise building. It was all glass, steel, and stark white walls. It did not look like a place where families worked out their differences. It looked like a place where contracts were terminated and assets were liquidated. It was exactly what I needed. Naomi looked exactly as intimidating as I remembered. She wore a sharp charcoal suit, her hair pulled back tightly. She didn't offer me coffee or pleasantries. She just tapped the stack of papers I had brought her and asked if this was some kind of elaborate prank. I told her it was very real, and I asked her if they could actually do this. Could they retroactively bill me for the food I ate when I was 9 years old? Naomi leaned back in her leather chair and let out a scoff. She told me no, they absolutely could not. She explained that parents have a legal, statutory obligation to care for their minor children. It is not a business transaction. She called the itemized list of my childhood expenses frivolous garbage that any judge would laugh out of court. I felt a massive wave of relief wash over me, but it was incredibly short-lived. Naomi leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She pointed to the final line item about the family property. She told me that the childhood bill was just an emotional smokescreen. The real danger was their attempt to establish a precedent of financial support. She explained that their lawyer was going to argue that over the past few years, I had willingly entered into a pattern of acting as the family's financial provider. They were going to claim that I had made verbal promises to support them and that they had relied on those promises when they drained their retirement to buy the $600,000 house. They were going to paint me as a wealthy, erratic daughter who promised to buy them a house and then cruelly pulled the rug out from under them. I stammered, telling her I never promised them a single thing. I told her I only ever helped out in emergencies. Naomi's expression hardened. She said she believed me, but we had to make the judge believe me. And we were not going to do that by playing defense. She remembered my family. She remembered that my credit card was the one that paid her $5,000 retainer for Chelsea's divorce. She looked at me intently and asked exactly how much money I had given my parents and my sister over the last few years. I whispered that I didn't know the exact number, but it was a lot. I paid rent, bought groceries, paid for car repairs, and covered medical bills. Naomi told me to go home. She instructed me to pull every single bank statement, every credit card bill, every Venmo transaction, and every text message I had exchanged with them for the past 3 years. She wanted a microscopic record of every single penny they had extracted from me. I spent the entire weekend sitting at my dining room table, surrounded by paper. It was an agonizing process. I had to temporarily unblock their numbers just to retrieve the archived text messages. I read through years of manipulation. My mother texting, "Your dad's truck needs tires, just send $500, you're a lifesaver." Chelsea texting, "The electric company is threatening to shut off the power, please help, the boys are scared." I took a bright yellow highlighter and marked every single transaction on my bank statements. $300 here. $2,000 there. $5,000 for the lawyer. $450 for groceries on the day Spencer left. When I finally put all the numbers into a master spreadsheet and hit sum, the final total made me physically nauseous. In just the last 2 years alone, I had transferred exactly $65,400 to my family. That was a massive down payment on my own house. That was a massive chunk of my retirement. I printed everything out. I bought heavy-duty plastic sleeves and categorized the receipts by month and by family member. I assembled 2 massive, heavy binders, each over 3 inches thick. It was a perfectly documented, itemized record of my own exploitation. I wasn't their daughter. I was their biggest investor. The day of the hearing, my stomach felt like it was filled with wet cement. I couldn't eat. I chose my outfit carefully. I didn't want to look like the wealthy, corporate monster they were portraying me as. I wore a simple, dark navy dress, a plain blazer, and put my hair in a low ponytail. I looked average. I looked invisible. I met Naomi outside the courtroom. The hallway smelled like old floor wax and nervous sweat. She looked at my pale face and told me to just keep my mouth shut, not to look at my parents, and let her do the talking. We walked into the small, wood-paneled hearing room. They were already sitting at the plaintiff's table. Harrison was wearing a suit that was visibly too tight for him, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and misplaced confidence. Brenda was playing her part perfectly, wearing a faded gray cardigan, looking small, frail, and weeping softly into a tissue. Chelsea sat between them, looking dead-eyed and exhausted, the ultimate prop of victimhood. I sat down next to Naomi. I could feel the heat of my father's glare burning into the side of my head, but I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the empty judge's bench. The bailiff announced the judge, a stern-looking older man named Judge Haynes. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and opened the case file. His tone was incredibly bored as he asked the plaintiffs to present their case. My parents' attorney stood up. He was a theatrical man who loved the sound of his own voice. He launched into a passionate monologue about the sacred, unbreakable bond of family. He painted a picture of Harrison and Brenda as two hardworking, blue-collar parents who sacrificed their youth to give me a perfect life. He claimed they invested everything they had into my success. And now, in their twilight years, when they had sacrificed their retirement to save their destitute older daughter, I, the wealthy, heartless defendant, had turned my back on them and broken a promise to help them secure a family home. It was a beautiful story. If I didn't know the truth, I would have hated myself. Then Harrison was called to the stand. He swore on the Bible and began to testify. He used the word investment over and over again to describe raising me. He fake cried as he described how his grandsons needed a backyard and how I had selfishly hoarded my money instead of repaying my debt to the family. When it was Naomi's turn to cross-examine him, she didn't pace. She didn't yell. She picked up one of the massive binders, walked over to the witness stand, and dropped it on the wooden ledge with a loud, echoing thud. She looked at Harrison and said, "Let's talk about investments, Mr. Mitchell." She opened the binder. She asked him to read Exhibit A aloud. It was the receipt for the $5,500 legal retainer I paid for Chelsea's divorce. Harrison stammered, his face turning purple. He mumbled that families help each other out. Naomi flipped the page. Exhibit B. The bank transfers totaling $12,000 for Chelsea's rent over 6 months. She asked him if he considered that helping out or if he considered it a salary. She flipped page after page. The credit card bills for groceries. The transfers for his truck repairs. The receipts for his wife's dental work. Naomi looked up at the judge, whose bored expression was entirely gone. He was leaning over his bench, staring intently at the binder. Naomi stated clearly for the record that in the past 2 years, the defendant had provided exactly $65,400 in documented financial support to the plaintiffs. She asked Harrison who was actually supporting whom. Brenda started sobbing louder, crying out from her table that it wasn't fair, that they just needed help with the mortgage for the boys. And then, the worst possible thing happened for their case. Chelsea, who had been completely silent, lost her temper. She stood up, ignoring her lawyer's frantic hand gestures to sit down, and pointed a shaking finger at me. In a voice filled with pure, childish venom, she shrieked, "She doesn't even have kids. She has all this money and an empty apartment. I have 2 boys. It's her duty to help us. It's not fair." The entire courtroom went dead silent. The judge slowly took off his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and looked at Chelsea with absolute disgust. He told her that having children was a choice, not a disability, and her sister's bank account was not a communal family asset. He gathered the files, looked down at my parents, and announced he would review the evidence and issue his ruling in 1 week. He slammed his gavel, and court was adjourned. The next 7 days were an agonizing blur. I went to work, stared blindly at spreadsheets, and came home to an apartment that felt like a waiting room. My logical brain knew that Naomi had destroyed their case, but the traumatized child inside me was still terrified. What if the judge was a traditionalist? What if he really believed that blood obligations trumped everything else? What if I was forced to spend the rest of my life paying for a house I would never be allowed to set foot in? On the morning of the verdict, the air in Seattle was heavy with a cold, gray drizzle. I wore the exact same navy dress. I met Naomi at the courthouse, and we walked into the hearing room. My family was already there. Chelsea did not show up this time. Harrison looked gray and exhausted, his false confidence completely stripped away. Brenda looked physically ill, clutching a crumpled tissue in her hands. We stood as Judge Haynes entered the room. He didn't waste any time. He didn't look up from his papers as he began to read his ruling. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought my chest would crack. He started by addressing the primary claim, the $324,000 bill for my childhood upbringing. His voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet room like a scalpel. He stated unequivocally that parents have a legal and moral duty to support their minor children. He said that children do not, under any circumstances, owe their parents a financial debt for being raised. He looked directly at Harrison and Brenda and said, "The idea of billing a child for food, clothing, or emotional guidance is frankly absurd. It is a gross perversion of the parental relationship. Therefore, the plaintiff's claim for repayment of upbringing costs is dismissed with prejudice." I let out a shaky breath, but the judge raised his hand. He wasn't finished. He turned his attention to the demand for the $276,000 to cover the luxury estate. He stated that it was abundantly clear to the court that this lawsuit was not a genuine claim for repayment. It was an act of coercion. It was an attempt to leverage the legal system to extort the defendant into paying a mortgage she never agreed to. He officially declared the claim to be frivolous and filed in bad faith. Then he looked at the two massive binders sitting on his desk. He said he had thoroughly reviewed the evidence provided by the defense. He noted the $65,400 I had transferred to them over 2 years. He looked at my parents, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of pity and contempt. The evidence shows a clear pattern of financial support, but it flows entirely from the defendant to the plaintiffs. She has, in effect, been your primary benefactor. The court finds that the defendant, Ms. Vanessa Mitchell, owes this family absolutely nothing. In fact, it is the opinion of this court that she has already given far too much. He suggested they go home and reflect on what the word family actually means. He struck his gavel one final time. Case dismissed. The finality of the sound echoed in the room. Naomi calmly zipped up her briefcase. I looked over at the plaintiff's table. Brenda was weeping, a quiet, hopeless sound, mourning the loss of the mansion she thought she had secured. Harrison stood up slowly. He pushed his chair in, turned, and looked at me. The look in his eyes will stay with me for the rest of my life. There was no sadness. There was no realization of his own terrible behavior. There was only pure, unadulterated, black hatred. He looked at me as if I were a stranger who had just burned his house down. He grabbed my mother by the arm, and without a single word, they walked out of the courtroom and out of my life forever. I stood up. My legs were a little unsteady, but I managed to walk out of the room, down the long hallway, and push open the heavy double doors of the courthouse. I stepped out into the Seattle rain. I looked up at the gray sky, closed my eyes, and took the deepest breath I had taken in 32 years. I tasted the cold air. It was my air. It wasn't borrowed. It wasn't conditional. It was mine. For the first time in my life, I was completely free. A year has passed since that day in court. The Seattle drizzle eventually turned into a bright, rare summer, and with it, my entire life changed. The first thing I did was move out of that gray, utilitarian apartment. It felt haunted by the memories of panic attacks and late-night emergency transfers. I took the money I had saved, the money that would have gone toward their ridiculous mortgage, and I bought a house. It is not a $600,000 luxury estate in a gated community. It is a small, modest, 1920s bungalow on the outskirts of the city. It has a tiny porch and a messy, overgrown backyard. But it is 100% mine. The very first weekend I moved in, I went to the hardware store and bought 3 gallons of paint. I painted my kitchen a bright, obnoxious, blindingly happy shade of yellow. My mother always hated the color yellow. She said it looked cheap and loud. I absolutely love it. Every morning, when I walk in to make my coffee, it feels like I am standing inside a sunbeam. I also went to the local animal shelter. I walked past the cages of barking puppies and found a small, battered gray tabby cat hiding in the back corner of a kennel. The tag on his cage said he was missing half an ear and was very quiet. I told the volunteer that I was very quiet, too. I named him Marble, and after a week of hiding under my bed, he finally came out and curled up on my lap. He hasn't left my side since. I was building a small, yellow, quiet life. I didn't hear a single word from my parents or my sister. It was as if they had simply vanished from the earth. Then, one Sunday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and my heart skipped a beat. It was an elderly couple. It was my grandfather Winston and my grandmother Evelyn. I hadn't spoken to them since the lawsuit began, assuming they hated me like the rest of the extended family. I opened the door cautiously. My grandfather was holding a freshly baked apple pie. My grandmother was holding a small potted tomato plant. My grandmother looked at me, her eyes completely clear and full of warmth. She reached out, touched my cheek, and told me I looked good. They came inside, and when my grandmother saw the kitchen, she smiled and told my grandfather that the yellow looked just like sunshine, just like me. We sat at my small table, ate warm apple pie, and talked. Eventually, my grandfather set his fork down and gently told me that they knew the truth. They said they knew exactly what Harrison and Brenda had tried to do. My grandmother took my hand across the table and told me that she had always seen how they treated me, and she was incredibly proud of me for finally standing up and walking away. I cried then. For the first time through the entire ordeal, I sat in my kitchen and cried. I cried for the family I never really had, and I cried because, finally, somebody saw me. My grandparents visit me every single Sunday now. They help me tend to the tomato plants on my back deck. They are my chosen family. Through them, I hear the occasional rumor. Harrison and Brenda had to forfeit their $120,000 down payment when they couldn't secure the rest of the financing for the estate. The loss of their retirement funds, combined with the legal fees, financially ruined them. They are currently renting a cramped, two-bedroom apartment. Chelsea eventually had to get a job working as a part-time receptionist to help pay their bills. They still tell anyone who will listen that I am a monster who destroyed the family. I don't feel anger anymore. I just feel a dull, distant pity for them. A few months ago, I was drinking my morning coffee with Marble on my lap, scrolling through my computer. I saw an email in my spam folder from an unrecognized address. It was from Brenda. The email was short and clumsily manipulative. She wrote that they were struggling in the small apartment, and since I had a whole house with extra space, they believed it would be best if Chelsea and the boys moved in with me. She wrote that it would show I was finally ready to be part of the family again. The old Vanessa would have felt her stomach twist with guilt. The new Vanessa just smiled, took a sip of her coffee, and hit reply. I typed a single word, no. I added one more sentence asking her to never contact me again. I hit send, blocked the new address, and closed my laptop. I walked over to my yellow kitchen window, looked out at my thriving tomato plants glowing in the morning sun, and realized something important. Peace isn't something you are given. It is something you have to earn, and I had paid my dues in full. So, what is your verdict? Was I wrong for cutting them off completely when they lost everything, or did they bring this entirely on themselves? Would you have sued them back for the $65,000? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as crazy as we did, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the best Reddit family drama stories. See you in the next video.